Before any kind of inspection work is started, you must take the following measures. Open all indicator cocks on the cylinder covers. Close the starting air shut-off valve. And engage the turning gear. After stopping the oil pumps, we can start the inspection work. This film is intended to help you inspect first the main bearing and thereafter the thrust bearing. You'll find all information necessary for inspecting the main bearings in the maintenance manual, Group 117, pages 2 to 5. At the beginning of the worksheets, you will always find a list of tools with the appropriate code numbers. From these numbers, you can trace the corresponding tools at the end of the maintenance manual, Group 940. These tools are needed for the bearing inspection, which now follows. The hydraulic tools must be in good condition. Afterwards, please read up carefully in the maintenance manual the directions given in this film. Always use the recommended tools and make sure that everything is spotlessly clean when assembling. The engine is turned with the turning gear till the appropriate crank web is horizontal. It is advisable to measure the bearing clearance before starting to dismantle, so that any bearing wear is detected. This special feeler gauge belonging to the standard tool set is used to measure the bearing clearance. Always pull the feeler blades back before removing the gauge from the bearing, otherwise they may break off. The correct bearing clearance can be obtained from the clearance table in the maintenance manual, Group 012, page 1. The clearance is not adjustable. Worn bearing shells must be replaced. The main bearings are pre-tensioned with thrust bolts. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 117, pages 2 and 2A, on loosening and tightening the bearing thrust bolts. After removing the oil pipe, locking wire and closing plugs, these connections with pressure gauge are fitted on the thrust bolts. Make sure that all high pressure connections are clean and undamaged. Check the oil level on the pump, because the pressure chamber on the thrust bolt must first be filled up when venting. Keep these vent screws open till oil emerges without bubbles. The pressure is raised to about 620 bar and maintained constant till the two nuts are slackened about 1 turn. If the thrust bolts should leak, so that no pressure can be built up, they can be released mechanically using this open-ended spanner. The thrust bolts are compressed till they can be dismantled and lifted out of the engine with a chain block. Close these oil inlets again so that no dirt can get in. The bearing cover and shells are subsequently dismantled as described in the maintenance manual, Group 117, pages 3 and 3A. The bearing cover is first raised a few millimeters to see whether the bearing shell stays down. If the shell sticks to the cover, it must be detached from this before lifting it further. Make sure that the suspension means employed are equal to the loads and are in good condition. All bearing parts must be treated with care and placed only on soft supports so that no damage is sustained. The upper bearing shell is taken out of the engine in the same way as the cover. The lower shell is dismantled in the sequence described in the maintenance manual, Group 117, pages 5 and 5A. To enable the lower bearing shell to be turned out, the crankshaft must be raised slightly. This is done using the jacks supplied for this purpose, which in turn stand on the support also provided in the tool set. This tool assists in turning out the lower shell. The shell is pulled out with a chain block and the appropriate wire ropes laid over a roller support. This special long Allen key enables the screws to be tightened. The wire ropes are attached here, laid under the bearing shell and connected over this roller with the chain block. Make sure once again that the jacks are exactly underneath the crankshaft center line. Secure the main switch for the turning gear in the off position in order to prevent any accidental turning of the crankshaft. The crankshaft lift is checked with the help of this dial gauge. Pressure is increased till the crankshaft is lifted off by 0.1 to 0.15 millimeters. When the crankshaft has been raised this way, we turn the bearing shell up and out. The shell must not be turned beyond the highest point, otherwise it may slip down again. We now take the lower bearing shell out of the engine as we did the upper one. This is important. Never dismantle two neighbouring lower bearing shells at the same time. The main bearing is ready for inspection. Depending on the instructions of the classification surveyor, either a new bearing or the dismantled one is fitted. The bearing is reassembled in the reverse sequence. Give the backs of the bearing shells a light application of Molykote paste or spray. Before fitting the bearing shell, Make sure that no foreign objects or dirt have got between the journal and the bearing saddle. All bearing parts must be absolutely clean and undamaged. Coat the inside of the bearing and the journal with clean engine oil. Check the bearing numbers on the shell and saddle. They must correspond. Before turning down the bearing shell, make sure that the pump pressure is the same as when the lower shell was dismantled. The bearing shell is aligned using this depth gauge. The parting surfaces must be parallel with the bed plate top surface. Once the crankshaft is resting on the shell again, it must not be turned, otherwise the shell may shift. If the crank deflection is to be measured, the bearing shell must be secured in its position with suitable pieces of wood. Make sure that the bearing numbers correspond. Coat the journal and the inside of the shell with clean engine oil. The bearing cover must be clean and must not be fitted oily. The ball heads and seating surfaces of the thrust bolts must be clean and undamaged. After aligning and tightening the thrust bolt nuts, make sure that the high pressure connections point in a direction to make them accessible for the connecting pieces with pressure gauges. Before the bearing cover is tensioned down, it must be aligned parallel with the bed plate top surface. Maximum admissible deviation from parallelism between dimensions A1 and A2 is 0.1 mm. Check up in the maintenance manual, group 117, page 2, figure A. After venting the thrust bolts, the pressure is raised to 600 bar and the two nuts are made tight with the help of the Tommy bar. Ensure that the nuts make proper contact, which is to be checked with a feeler gauge, and that all three pressure gauges show the same reading. When the pressure has dropped, the parallelism must be checked once more. If the difference between dimensions A1 and A2 exceeds 0.1 mm, the entire procedure must be repeated. Measure the bearing clearance again with the special feeler gauge and compare it with the values in the clearance table, group 012, page 1. Finally, the two thrust bolt nuts and the vent screws are secured with wire. Make sure that no tools or other objects have been left in the crankcase. If the lower bearing shell has been changed, the crank deflection must be checked. Routine inspection of the thrust bearing is generally confined to measuring the axial clearance and visual checkover. You'll find all necessary instructions for inspecting the thrust bearing in the Maintenance Manual, Group 120, pages 1 and 1A. To make a visual checkover, the cover at the thrust bearing and the first crankcase door must be opened. Before you enter the thrust bearing space, remove from your pockets all objects that may drop into the bearing casing. Look for any fouling when performing the visual check. At the same time, the condition of the gears can be inspected. Check also all locking devices in the thrust bearing space. Between the thrust bearing and the crankcase, at the lowest point at cylinder 1, you will find a flange with a small hole. Shortly after stopping the engine, check whether oil escapes through this small hole. Look up the Maintenance Manual, Group 120, page 1. If this hole happens to be clogged, the flange must be dismantled and the hole cleared. At the same time, the space behind it can be inspected. To enable the axial play to be measured, the propeller shaft must be shifted into its ahead and astern positions. It should be possible to find ways and means of applying pressure axially with a jack on the propeller shaft. Here you see one of various approaches. The displacement of the propeller shaft must be checked unfailingly with a dial gauge so that you can register reaching the ahead end position. After pressure has built up on the jack, give a kick with the turning gear to overcome the adhesive friction in the bearings. Without unloading the jack, measure the distance X. From this value, the wear on the ahead thrust bearing can be ascertained. Look up the Maintenance Manual, Group 120, page 1A, figure B. The amount by which the distance X is less than the value entered in the acceptance report corresponds to the wear on the ahead thrust bearing. Before shifting the crankshaft into the astern position, the dial gauge must be set to 0 so that the total play can be determined. If the engine is tilted sternwards, it is usually enough to turn the engine with the turning gear for the propeller shaft to shift back again. If the propeller shaft does not shift astern, it must be assisted with jacks, in a similar fashion to shifting it ahead. The value read off on the dial gauge is the total thrust bearing clearance. Compare it with the clearance table in the Maintenance Manual, Group 012, page 1. The total clearance can also be found by measuring the distance X. If the thrust bearing clearance exceeds the maximum, the thrust pads must be replaced. Dismantling and fitting the thrust bearing are described in the Maintenance Manual, Group 120, page 2A. At the final check, make sure that all tools have been removed from the engine and that everything is in clean condition. If you have any questions about this film, or any aspect of operation and maintenance of Sulzer engines, please contact your nearest Sulzer service representative. Our worldwide organization is glad to be of assistance to you. During the next few running hours, the temperature of the affected bearings must be checked manually and compared with that of unaffected bearings.